Hello, today we're going to take a look at Unit 2, Colonization, reviewing the concepts and terms and themes that we learned within Unit 2 to help us prepare for the benchmark exam. So, one of the first things we took a look at was the goals for colonization. So we learned about a couple of countries that came and started setting up in North America. They had a couple of things that they had in common. There are three colonies that came into North America. You had Spain, England, and France. And all three of these nations wanted to spread Christianity, and more importantly, all three of these nations wanted to gain wealth. The thing that made these three a little bit different was the fact that Spain and England wanted to establish colonies, and they wanted to gain wealth primarily through precious metals. And France wanted to establish trading forts, and they wanted their fur trade to help them gain their wealth. Now, Spain was able to find some precious metals. England, however, was not able to find any precious metals. So, moving on, a couple of factors that challenged the early success of colonies. There were several things that challenged all these successes that were eventually going to take place. You had natural disasters. You had those hurricanes. You had the harsh winters. You had things like that. And then you had attacks from Native Americans. They didn't have good relationships with Native Americans, and they were moving into territories that were held by Native Americans, so they were fighting back. And then, of course, they had death. Death was related to the fact that people were dying. They were starving, and we're going to talk more specifically about one of those colonies. And in one of the colonies in particular, the entire colony disappeared off of Roanoke. No one knows what happened to these people. They just disappeared. All these challenges were coming because they weren't ready for all these conditions. They didn't have the supplies. It would take months for supply ships to come from England. And then, as we kind of already talked, we had the harsh winters. They weren't ready for the winters. They didn't have enough supplies to be able to survive the winters, and they just were not prepared for the conditions. They didn't come in and start farming and getting those supplies that they needed. Now, there were some factors that led to their successes. Specifically in the St. Augustine colony, they started marrying with Native Americans. So when they started marrying Native American women, they were forming those relationships with Native Americans. Eventually, they would be able to start receiving profits from the trade, and we're going to look specifically at the Jamestown colony that got established in 1607 that led to this. And then, more importantly, they were learning to adapt to the land. Again, that came from the improved relationships with Native Americans, because the Native Americans were teaching them how to adapt to the land. And so you can see with the next one here, you have learning from the Native Americans. And then another key factor was they were receiving supplies from their home country. So Jamestown would eventually succeed. Jamestown was first established in 1607, and they went through some really harsh times. The Jamestown colonists had a lot to overcome, and the harshest of all was the starving time that they experienced. All of this really had to do with decisions that they made, which impacted their survival. When they came, they brought a lot of gentlemen and not a lot of laborers, so they didn't have a lot of people who were working. They did not develop good relationships with the Native Americans. Eventually, they were able to succeed because they were able to improve the relationships with the Native Americans. And then they were able to get those supply ships from England. And the most important thing is they had the discovery of a cash crop, tobacco. Tobacco is one of the biggest things that led to their success. Now, this is going to have a negative impact because of the tobacco. It was labor intensive, and it would lead to the growth of slavery in the colonies. So with the cash crop of tobacco, it required a lot of labor. Colonists first turned to indentured servants. So what is an indentured servant? It is someone who paid for the passage for someone to come to America, and they worked 5 to 7 years to pay off that price of passage. So what you're really talking about here is they needed someone to work. They would go to England, they would find someone to come to America, they'd pay for their passage, and because they paid for that passage, that person would have to work off that debt, and that debt cost 5 to 7 years of labor. Now, as we're moving on, you had Native American response strategies. So we got all these colonists coming over, and you have these Native Americans who are living here. So what are they going to do? They have three ways that they could respond to all the English coming over. One of the first strategies they could use accommodation, and this is making necessary adjustments to survive, such as trading for materials that were needed or learning the English language so they can communicate with them. It's given up a little bit of part of their own culture, but they're doing it just so that they can survive. Another one that took place is assimilation, when they accepted another culture as their own. So they're giving up their own culture, taking on somebody else's culture, such as the way that you dress, as you can see in the picture here. These are pictures of Native Americans. On the left you have traditional dress, and then once they assimilated, they started dressing more like the Europeans. Or when they gave up their own religion and started taking on the religion of the Europeans. So with your last Native American response strategy, is they can just resist it altogether. This is going against or fighting against the changes of another culture. So what you're talking about, you had a lot of conflicts and battles that were taking place, none more famous than the Pequot War of 1637 and 1638, and that is what this is a picture of, that actual war. So another important concept that we need to know within this unit is the growth of colonial regions. Three regions developed in the United States due to the differences in natural resources. So over here you have a picture of the three regions. You have the New England colonies up here, and in the pink you had your middle colonies, and then your southern colonies down here. Remember, Florida is under Spanish control, so this is not part of the colonies at this point. So, how did they develop into being the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies? Really what it came down to is each area had different natural resources. In the north, when you were looking at the New England colonies, they had lots of trees, but they had very poor soil. So these colonies up here developed, and lumber became a major export of theirs, so they relied on that lumber, and they were able to build ships, and they became great fishermen up here in the New England colonies. In the middle colonies, they had some pretty good soil, but they had a shorter growing season. They had more open lands, not a lot of trees like you've seen up in the New England colonies. So they end up developing more of cattle, so they had the cows and horses and things like that for grazing. Now, southern colonies, they had great soil, and the weather lent itself to having longer growing season, and this is why you've seen the very large farms, eventually plantations, that would take root in the southern part of the colonies. Now, as we're talking about economics, triangular trade. North America had all these natural resources. So they had these natural resources, of which England, specifically Great Britain, did not have. So they were trading those natural resources to England, because there are other resources that we needed here in America that we didn't have, so we got them from England. So a trading system was developed. So because we had the abundance of natural resources, England was able to turn those natural resources into a finished product. This led to a trade system between North America, Europe, and Africa. This became known as triangular trade, or the transatlantic trade. Remember that one, transatlantic trade. So this is where we got slaves. Slaves came in from Africa as Africa became part of this triangular trade, or this transatlantic trade system. Mercantilism is really a part of the triangular trade. It is a system of trade developed by Great Britain, really just to gain more wealth. What they were able to do is they were able to get these natural resources for a very low price. They would take these raw materials, natural resources, for cheap, and they were able to make manufactured goods in their factories in Europe, and then they would turn around and sell them back to the colonies, but at a very large profit. Because of this, they were able to maintain a favorable balance of trade. The key to remember with this is mercantilism was about wealth. The system was created to gain more wealth. Now, moving on, when you're looking at some of the social aspects, you have the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening was basically a big religious revival that took place in the 1700s in the colonies. This took place because the preachers were concerned about the decline in spirituality. They were experiencing a lot of economic prosperity, and because things were going so well, they turned away from religion a little bit. So a couple of preachers came in